June 5th, 1944, 24 hours before D-Day. An RAF reconnaissance pilot climbs to 15,000 feet over East Anglia. His mission: photograph German coastal defences across the Channel. But as he banks westward to return to base, something catches his eye. Something impossible. Below him, stretching from the Wash to the Thames estuary, he sees what looks like a geometric disease spreading across the English countryside. Rectangles of concrete. Miles of them. Hundreds of them. Each one nearly 2 miles long, carved into farmland that had grown wheat for 1,000 years. He counts them as he flies. 20 airfields visible from this single vantage point. 40. 60. He stops counting. Each airfield is a small city. Runways that could land a commercial airliner today. Hard stands for 50 heavy bombers. Control towers. Hangars that could swallow a cathedral. Barracks for 3,000 men. And on every single one, American B-17 and B-24s sit wing to wing, being armed and fueled for the greatest invasion in human history. Here's the number that changes everything. In less than 3 years, American engineers had built 122 heavy bomber bases across England. More airfield construction than the rest of the world combined during the same period. They poured more concrete in rural England than was used to build the entire US interstate highway system up to that point. They transformed 1/8 of England's arable land into what Churchill would call a fleet of unsinkable aircraft carriers. But this astronomical achievement nearly didn't happen, because in 1942, when the Americans first proposed their plan, the British looked at the timeline, looked at their island, and said one word: impossible. To understand how America built an aerial empire on British soil, how they overcame not just engineering challenges, but diplomatic nightmares, how they reshaped an ancient landscape in months, and how it all vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, we have to go back. Back to 1941, when Britain's airfield infrastructure was designed for an entirely different kind of war. Back to when the idea of basing 1,000 American heavy bombers in England was pure fantasy. Back to when England wasn't ready for an invasion by its own allies. September 1941, before Pearl Harbor, before America's entry into the war. Major General James H. Jimmy Doolittle steps off a transport at RAF Hendon and surveys what Britain calls its airfield network. He's here on a secret mission: assess whether England can host the American heavy bomber force that exists, at this moment, only in Hap Arnold's strategic imagination. What he finds horrifies him. The RAF operates from grass fields. Beautiful, pastoral, utterly inadequate grass fields. These aren't airfields in the American sense. They're pastures with a windsock. Spitfires and Hurricanes, weighing 5 tons empty, can operate from grass. The RAF has built its entire defensive doctrine around lightweight fighters scrambling from these compact, dispersed bases. But here's the problem that makes Doolittle's report read like a death sentence for the American bombing campaign. A B-17 flying fortress weighs 35 tons empty. Fully loaded for a mission over Germany, it weighs 65 tons. Its tires exert ground pressure that would turn British grass fields into ploughed mud after a single takeoff. Britain's airfield infrastructure, Doolittle writes, is designed for interception, not projection. For defense, not offense. It cannot support heavy bomber operations in any meaningful capacity. The numbers tell the story. In September 1941, Britain has 132 operational RAF stations. Exactly 9 of them have concrete runways. 9. And those 9 were built reluctantly, viewed by RAF commanders as excessive, expensive, and unnecessary for fighter operations. RAF Group Captain Hugh Pugie Lloyd walks Doolittle through RAF Bassingbourn, one of those rare concrete facilities. "We built these as bomber stations," Lloyd explains, gesturing at a single 4,000-foot runway. "For Wellingtons and Sterlings." Doolittle does the math in his head. American doctrine calls for 6,000-foot runways, minimum for heavy bombers, 7,000 feet for safety margin, 8,000 feet for full bomb loads in summer heat. And that's just one runway. American doctrine calls for 3 runways per field. 2 main runways in different orientations for wind variation, 1 auxiliary for emergencies. "How many bombers can you base here?" Doolittle asks. 30 Sterlings comfortably, Lloyd responds. 50 if we push it. Doolittle nods politely. He's just done the calculation for American requirements. When the 8th Air Force becomes operational, a single bomber group will need to base 50 B-17. The 8th Air Force, as currently planned, will have 40 groups, 2,000 heavy bombers. They'd need to completely rebuild Bassingbourn, then build 60 more just like it, on an island where every acre of flat land is either farmed or already occupied. Back in his London hotel, Doolittle composes his report to General Arnold. He chooses his words carefully, knowing they'll reach Roosevelt within days. British infrastructure is inadequate for projected heavy bomber operations. RAF grass fields unusable. Existing concrete facilities insufficient in number, length, and capacity. Estimated requirement: 100+ new heavy bomber stations, each requiring 3 runways, minimum 6,000 feet, 50 hard stands, hangars, fuel storage, ammunition storage, barracks for 3,000+ personnel. He pauses, pen hovering over paper, then adds the sentence that will define the next 3 years. This is the largest construction project in military history. If it cannot be accomplished, strategic bombing of Germany from England is impossible. But here's what Doolittle doesn't yet know. The political battle to seize enough British land for this project will be fiercer than many combat missions, because Britain in 1941 isn't just fighting Germany, it's fighting starvation. The U-boat campaign is strangling Britain. Merchant ship sinkings have reached catastrophic levels. Food imports have collapsed. The government has launched the Dig for Victory campaign, converting every possible acre, golf courses, private estates, municipal parks, into farmland. Britain is barely feeding itself. And now the Americans want to pave over some of Britain's most productive agricultural land, the very land keeping Britain alive. Lord Woolton, Minister of Food, reads Doolittle's preliminary report and immediately fires off a memo to Churchill. "If the Americans pave East Anglia, we will starve before we can be bombed into submission." RAF Air Chief Marshal Charles Portal has a different concern. He reads the same report and sees something more threatening than lost farmland. He sees sovereignty slipping away. 100 American bases, he writes in his diary. That's not an alliance. That's an occupation. Neither Woolton nor Portal knows that in Washington, in the weeks after Pearl Harbor, Hap Arnold is looking at Doolittle's report and seeing not impossibility, but destiny. Arnold believes, with evangelical certainty, that heavy bombers will win the war, and he's about to demand something even more audacious than Doolittle imagined. Not 60 bases, not 80, 122. And he wants them operational in less than 3 years. January 1942, the Arcadia Conference, Washington, D.C. General Henry Hap Arnold sits across from Air Chief Marshal Portal in a Pentagon conference room. Between them lies a map of England marked with red circles, Doolittle's proposed airfield locations. Arnold has just finished presenting what he calls the strategic blueprint for defeating Germany. Portal has just called it madness. "You're asking for half of East Anglia," Portal says, his voice tight. "Do you understand what that means?" "That's where Britain grows its food." Arnold leans forward. He's 55 years old, a pilot since 1911, and he's been waiting his entire career for this moment, for strategic air power to move from theory to reality. He's not about to let British agricultural concerns derail destiny. "I understand you're hungry," Arnold says. "I understand U-boats are sinking supply ships. But here's what I understand better. Germany cannot be defeated by blockade alone. Cannot be defeated by nibbling at the periphery. Germany must be struck at its industrial heart. And the only way to do that, right now, today, is with heavy bombers. From England." Arnold slides a document across the table. It's titled a WPD-42, the Army Air Force's War Plan. Portal picks it up, starts reading, and his expression shifts from skepticism to something closer to shock. The plan calls for 2,000 B-17 and B-24s based in England by mid-1943, 4,000 bombers by 1944, each aircraft requiring support from 20 to 30 ground crew, mechanics, armourers, cooks, medics, administrators, each group requiring mountains of bombs, rivers of aviation fuel, spare parts, barracks, mess halls, hospitals. "This isn't a force," Portal says quietly. "This is a migration." "Call it whatever you want," Arnold responds. "But here are the numbers that matter. German ball-bearing production is concentrated in Schweinfurt. Destroy those factories, and Germany's aircraft production collapses within months. Aircraft engine production is concentrated in several key cities. Synthetic fuel plants are identifiable, targetable, destructible. Destroy Germany's ability to make weapons and fuel them, and the ground war becomes a formality." Portal isn't convinced about the doctrine. He has fundamental disagreements with American daylight bombing theory. But that's not his immediate concern. His immediate concern is impossible logistics. "Even if I agreed with your strategy," Portal says, "and I don't, where exactly do you propose to put 122 airfields? Britain is a small island. We're already using every suitable piece of flat ground." Arnold pulls out another map. This one shows East Anglia, Lincolnshire, Cambridgeshire, marked with dozens of proposed sites. Each one has been surveyed by Doolittle's team. Each one is currently farmland. "You requisition the land," Arnold says simply. "We'll build the bases." Requisition. Portal repeats the word like it's foreign. You say that as if it's simple. These are working farms. People live there. People who've farmed that land for generations. "People can move," Arnold says. "Land can't." And the land is what we need. This is the moment the partnership nearly breaks, because Portal sees what Arnold either doesn't see or doesn't care about. This isn't just about building airfields. This is about fundamentally altering Britain's landscape, economy, and sovereignty. This is about turning a significant portion of England into American territory. But Churchill, who's been briefed on the conversation, sees something Portal doesn't. Britain has no choice. The Americans are offering to bring the war to Germany's heartland. They're offering strategic bombing on a scale the RAF can't match. Yes, it requires paving East Anglia. Yes, it requires displacing farmers. Yes, it requires allowing American engineers to reshape the British countryside. But the alternative is continuing to lose the war by attrition, Churchill's directive to Portal is brief and brutal. Give the Americans what they need. All of it. Wherever they need it. However quickly they need it. In March 1942, the Ministry of Agriculture receives a classified list from the War Office. 122 locations. Coordinates, acreage requirements. Each site averaging 600 to 800 acres. Total land to be requisitioned, approximately 100,000 acres. That's 156 square miles. That's an area larger than the city of Liverpool. That's productive farmland, currently growing wheat, barley, sugar beets, the crops keeping Britain fed while U-boats prowl the Atlantic. But here's the number that truly captures the scale of what's about to happen. In the next 30 months, American engineers will pour more concrete in rural England than Britain has poured in its entire aviation history. They'll build 300 runways, each one 1.5 miles long. They'll create 6,000 aircraft hardstands, parking spaces for 65-ton bombers. They'll construct 1,500 miles of perimeter track. They'll build 30 million square feet of hangars. And they'll do it while Britain is still at war, still rationing, still struggling to feed itself. Major General Robert Candy, newly appointed commander of the 8th Air Force Service Command, reads his orders in April 1942 and realizes he's been handed the most complex construction challenge in military history. He has to build infrastructure for 300,000 Americans in a foreign country, using mostly British labor and materials, while the country is under intermittent air attack, without disrupting Britain's war production, and on a timeline that assumes everything will go perfectly. Candy is an engineer, not a diplomat. He understands concrete stress tolerances and drainage calculations. What he doesn't understand yet is that he's about to trigger a social and political crisis that will echo through English villages for generations. Because while generals in London and Washington debate strategy and logistics, thousands of British farmers are about to receive identical letters. Letters that begin with the same sentence. Your land has been requisitioned by His Majesty's government for the prosecution of the war. And that's where the real battle begins. April 1942, Thurley, Bedfordshire. Thomas Walden has farmed 180 acres outside Thurley since 1919. His father farmed it before him, his grandfather before that. The Waldens have worked this specific land since the 1780s. They grow wheat, barley, and raise dairy cattle. They've survived agricultural depressions, droughts, and the First World War. But they will not survive the letter that arrives on April 23, 1942. The letter is signed by the local land agent, acting on behalf of the Air Ministry. It informs Thomas Walden that 165 of his 180 acres have been requisitioned under Defence Regulation 51. He has 90 days to vacate. Compensation will be determined by a government tribunal. Appeals will not be heard until after the war. The letter concludes, "This action is necessary for the successful prosecution of the war effort and the defence of the realm." What the letter doesn't mention. Walden's farm is about to become RAF Thurley, one of 122 American heavy bomber bases. Within 6 months, his wheat fields will be buried under 3 feet of concrete, stone aggregate, and asphalt. His farmhouse will be demolished. His hedgerows, some of them 400 years old, will be bulldozed. His land will never grow wheat again. Thomas Walden is not unique. In the spring and summer of 1942, more than 2,000 British farming families receive identical letters. The locations read like a gazetteer of rural England. Bassingbourn, Molesworth, Kimbolton, Poddington, Grafton Underwood, Chelveston, Deenathorpe, Polebrook. Each name represents a village about to be transformed or erased. The process is legal. Defense regulation. 51 grants the government sweeping powers to requisition land for war purposes. But legal doesn't mean accepted. In villages across East Anglia, Lincolnshire, and Cambridgeshire, farmers begin organising resistance. The National Farmers Union convenes an emergency meeting in Cambridge. Robert Hudson, president of the NFU, stands before 300 angry farmers and delivers a speech that captures the fury building in the countryside. They are taking our most productive land, not marginal land, not wasteland, not the sandy soil or the rocky hillsides. They are taking the black earth of Cambridgeshire, the clay loam of Bedfordshire, the most productive farmland in Britain. While we are under blockade, while the government begs us to grow more food, while every poster in London screams, "Dig for victory." He's right. The site selection wasn't random. American planners specifically chose flat, well-drained land, which happens to be identical to the characteristics of premium farmland. They needed land without significant hills, close to rail lines, away from major population centres, but accessible to supply routes. That description perfectly matches Britain's agricultural heartland. A farmer from Grafton Underwood stands and shouts what everyone is thinking. They're Americans. Why should British farmers sacrifice for American bases? Hudson's response is quiet. Because if we lose this war, it won't matter who was British and who was American. We'll all be speaking German. But private anger is different from public acquiescence. In Deenathorpe, a group of farmers physically block surveyors from accessing their land. In Podington, land agents are turned away at gunpoint. In Kimbolton, farmers flood the local MP's office with petitions demanding parliamentary intervention. The protests accomplish nothing. By July 1942, every requisition order has been enforced. Farmers who resisted find themselves escorted from their land by military police. The government compensation is based on pre-war land values, a fraction of what the land is worth during wartime agricultural boom. Many farmers will spend decades in legal battles trying to recover fair compensation. But here's what complicates the simple narrative of American aggression and British victimhood. Many of the requisition orders are carried out by British officials, not Americans. Many of the bases will initially house RAF squadrons, not the 8th Air Force. The land grab is technically British government policy. The Americans are simply the ultimate beneficiaries. Group Captain Tom Sawyer, RAF liaison to the 8th Air Force Service Command, tries to explain this nuance to increasingly hostile village meetings. He fails repeatedly. The Americans are not invading, Sawyer says at a meeting in Bedford. They're responding to our invitation. Britain asked for American help. This is what that help requires. A woman in the audience stands. Her name is Margaret Tilney. Her family has lived in Podington for 11 generations. She speaks with the kind of controlled rage that's more devastating than shouting. My grandfather fought at the Somme. My father was at Dunkirk. My brother is in North Africa right now. Don't tell me about Britain asking for help. We didn't ask you to destroy our villages. We didn't ask you to erase our heritage. And we certainly didn't give you permission to hand our country over to Americans who will leave the moment the war ends, leaving us with ruined land and broken communities. She's wrong about one thing. Not all the Americans will leave when the war ends. Some will marry British women. Some will stay in England permanently. But she's right about the fundamental question that haunts these meetings. Who owns England during a war fought to preserve it? Major General Candy, touring the requisitioned sites in August 1942, sees the anger and understands he's not just building airfields. He's navigating a diplomatic crisis with every foundation he pours. His solution is pragmatic. Hire British labour. Pay above market rates. Source materials locally when possible. Make the construction itself an economic stimulus that partially compensates for the agricultural loss. It's a calculated strategy, but it creates new tensions, because now American engineers with revolutionary construction methods are about to work alongside British construction crews who've been building the slow way for centuries, and that cultural collision is about to produce both miracles and fury. September 1942. Bassingbourn, Cambridgeshire. The 1st American Engineer Battalion arrives to begin conversion of RAF Bassingbourn into a heavy bomber station. They're led by Colonel Arthur McKinnon, a civil engineer from Seattle who built dams and highways during the Depression. He's now responsible for tripling the size of Bassingbourn in 6 months. He takes one look at the British construction crew waiting for him and realizes the timeline just became impossible. The British crew is using the same construction method they've used for years: systematic, methodical, slow. They excavate carefully. They lay drainage meticulously. They pour concrete in sections, waiting for each section to cure before proceeding. McKinnon calls it peacetime construction in wartime. He pulls out blueprints for what the Americans call rapid runway construction, a revolutionary technique developed by the Army Corps of Engineers. The British foreman, a man named Robert Hewitt, who's been building airfields since 1936, looks at the plans with undisguised skepticism. "You're proposing to excavate the entire runway bed simultaneously," Hewitt says. "You're proposing to pour concrete in continuous runs, not sections. You're proposing to use equipment I've never seen before." "That's right," McKinnon responds, "because your method will take 12 months. We have 6. Hewitt shakes his head. "It won't work. The concrete will crack. The drainage will fail. You'll end up rebuilding everything." "Then we'll rebuild," McKinnon says. "But we'll hit the deadline." What follows is one of the most intensive construction programs in history, and it works by breaking every rule in the British Construction Handbook. The Americans bring equipment that British contractors have never seen: diesel-powered scrapers that can move 500 cubic yards of earth per hour, concrete mixers mounted on trucks, asphalt pavers that lay runway surface in continuous strips, fleets of bulldozers working in coordinated teams. But here's what makes the technique revolutionary. The Americans don't just use big machines. They use a fundamentally different construction philosophy. British method. Build one runway completely before starting the next. Build it perfectly. Build it to last decades. American method. Build all 3 runways simultaneously. Build fast. Build adequately. If it lasts 5 years, that's enough. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Horn, McKinnon's deputy, explains the philosophy in his diary. The British build for permanence. They're thinking about what these airfields will look like in 1960. We're thinking about what they'll look like in June 1943. We're not building monuments, we're building weapons. And like all weapons, they only need to last as long as the war. The approach horrifies traditional British engineers. But it works. At Bassingbourn, 3 runways are laid simultaneously. American crews work 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. Night work is illuminated by portable generators and floodlights, another innovation that shocks locals' use to blackout restrictions. The concrete itself is different. American specifications call for a limestone aggregate mixture that cures faster than traditional British limestone and gravel mix. The runways are thicker, nearly 3 feet of layered stone, gravel and concrete, engineered to support fully loaded bombers taking off in formation. And the drainage system is revolutionary. Instead of relying on surface runoff, the Americans install a network of underground pipes every 50 feet along each runway. Thousands of miles of ceramic pipe burying across England, carrying rainwater away from surfaces that must remain dry for bombers landing in British weather. Robert Hewitt watches this systematic demolition of traditional methods and slowly becomes a convert. By November, he's recommending American techniques to other British crews. "They're mad," he tells a colleague, "absolutely mad. But they're also right. I've spent 6 years learning to build airfields that last forever. They've spent 6 months learning to build airfields that work immediately. And immediately is what we need." But speed has a human cost. Between September 1942 and June 1944, 21 months, the 8th Air Force Service Command and its British contractors will pour approximately 20 million cubic yards of concrete across England. They'll employ, at peak, more than 55,000 construction workers. They'll run thousands of pieces of heavy equipment simultaneously across more than 100 sites. The accident rate is catastrophic by modern standards. Heavy equipment working at wartime speed, often at night under blackout conditions. Concrete trucks overturning. Workers caught in excavation collapses. Crane failures. Chemical exposure from rapid cure concrete additives. Official records list 127 construction deaths between 1942 and 1944. Unofficial estimates run higher. Some accidents on remote sites were never properly documented. Charles Webb, age 19, crushed by a bulldozer at Molesworth in January 1943. His body was found 3 hours after the accident. No one had seen him fall. James Morrison, age 43, killed when a concrete truck tipped over at Kimbolton in April 1943. Robert Ford, age 28, electrocuted by a portable generator at Grafton Underwood in August 1943. These men are as much casualties of the air war as any bomber crew. They're just buried in civilian cemeteries, not military ones. But by spring 1943, the impossible is becoming visible. At Bassingbourn, 3 runways stand where wheat grew 18 months earlier. At Molesworth, at Grafton Underwood, at Kimbolton, at Podington, across East Anglia, massive concrete rectangles are appearing on land that had been green for centuries. Each base follows an identical layout, refined through trial and error across dozens of sites. 3 runways arranged in a triangle pattern, each 6,000 feet minimum, many extending to 7,000 or even 8,000 feet. 50 concrete hardstands, parking areas for bombers, arranged around the perimeter track, each hardstand large enough for a B-17 with 103-foot wingspan, spaced far enough apart that if one aircraft explodes, it won't destroy its neighbors. 2 T-2 hangars, massive steel structures capable of housing 4 B-17s simultaneously for maintenance. Technical site, administrative buildings, operations center, briefing rooms, intelligence offices. Living site, barracks for 3,000 men, officers' quarters, mess halls, hospitals, chapels, recreation halls. Storage areas, bomb dumps capable of holding 1,500 tons of high explosive, aviation fuel farms with capacity for 500,000 gallons. Each base is a self-contained military city. Each one costs approximately $8 million, $1943, equivalent to nearly $140 million today. Multiply that by 122 bases, and the total cost approaches $17 billion in modern dollars. That's just construction. That doesn't include the cost of the aircraft, personnel, bombs, or operations. By June 1943, 50 bases are operational. By December 1943, 90 bases. By March 1944, all 122 heavy bomber stations are complete. The transformation is visible from the air. That RAF reconnaissance pilot, returning from missions over France, no longer recognizes his own country. East Anglia looks like it's been infected by geometry, rigid rectangles stamped onto organic countryside. The poet Stephen Spender, visiting East Anglia in early 1944, writes, "The countryside has become an artifact. Nature has been forced into military service. Even the hedgerows look defeated." But Colonel Mackinnon, surveying the completed network from his office in High Wycombe, sees something else. He sees the greatest concentration of military air power in human history. He sees the infrastructure that will make D-Day possible. He also sees something the planners in Washington never quite grasped. These bases aren't temporary. Concrete doesn't disappear. Runways don't heal like wounds. Whatever happens after the war, England has been permanently altered. The farmers knew that. The protesters knew that. The Americans were just too busy building to care. May 24th, 1944. RAF, Thorpe Abbotts, Norfolk. Home of the 100th Bombardment Group. 0430 hours, 13 days before D-Day. Technical Sergeant Michael DiStefano walks the perimeter track at Thorpe Abbotts, checking each hardstand. He's a crew chief, responsible for keeping B-17s airworthy in conditions that would bankrupt civilian airlines. This morning, he's preparing 21 flying fortresses for a mission over Berlin. Each aircraft sits on a concrete hardstand, precisely 120 feet in diameter, connected to the perimeter track by a short taxiway. Each hardstand is slightly raised and crowned for drainage, because English rain doesn't care about bombing missions. DiStefano's team of 8 mechanics has been working since midnight, inspecting engines, checking control surfaces, loading ammunition. The pre-flight routine has been refined to industrial efficiency over 2 years of operations. But here's what makes this morning different from every previous mission. DiStefano can hear 20 other bases conducting identical operations. The sound carries across the flat Norfolk landscape. The growl of engines, the clank of bomb-loading equipment, the shouts of ground crews. By dawn, more than 1,000 B-17 and B-24s will take off from bases within a 30-mile radius. They'll assemble into combat formations over England before heading east to Germany. The logistics of that single morning will involve more moving parts than any military operation in history to that point. This is what 122 airfields make possible. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Rosie Rosenthal, pilot of the B-17 Rosie's Riveters, stands at the end of Thorpe Abbotts' main runway and watches the first bombers take off. Each aircraft needs 4,500 feet of concrete to get airborne with a full bomb load. Each takeoff occurs at precise 30-second intervals. Any closer, and prop wash from the leading aircraft could flip the following bomber. The math is brutal. 21 aircraft from Thorpe Abbotts at 30-second intervals equals 10.5 minutes of continuous takeoffs. Multiply that across multiple bases, and the entire 8th Air Force requires more than 2 hours just to get airborne. That's why the bases are spaced exactly where they are. American planners positioned them in a geographic arc across East Anglia. Each base assigned a specific assembly altitude and location. The bombers don't just take off, they climb into assigned airspace, circle until their formation assembles, then join the larger stream heading east. It's aerial choreography on an impossible scale, and it only works because of the infrastructure beneath it. Major Donald MacDonald, operations officer for the 100th Bomb Group, watches from the control tower, a 2-story concrete structure that gives visual range over the entire airfield. He's tracking takeoffs, monitoring radio traffic, and coordinating with dozens of other bases. The control tower is the nervous system of each base. From here, controllers manage not just bomber operations, but everything else. The ambulances stationed at runway ends in case of crashes, the fire crews ready for fuel fires, the mechanics waiting to service aircraft that abort missions with mechanical problems. But the real miracle of these bases isn't visible from the control tower. It's happening simultaneously across hundreds of dispersed locations on each field. The bomb dump at Thorpe Abbotts sits a half-mile from the technical site, deliberately isolated, so that if it explodes, it won't destroy the entire base. Today, ordnance crews are loading 336,000 pounds of bombs onto trucks, 16 500-pound bombs per aircraft, 21 aircraft. At the fuel farm, pumps are transferring 46,200 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel into bomber tanks, 2,200 gallons per aircraft. The fuel arrives by train at a siding, specially built to connect each base to the British rail network. The 8th Air Force is consuming more fuel than some small countries. In the mess halls, cooks are preparing breakfast for 3,000 men. The food arrives through a supply chain that stretches back to American farms, crosses the Atlantic on Liberty ships, distributes through British ports, and fans out across the airfield network on a fleet of trucks that operates 24 hours a day. Captain James Geary, supply officer, manages this impossible juggling act from an office in the technical site. His job is to ensure that Thorpe Abbotts never runs out of anything: fuel, bombs, ammunition, spare parts, food, medical supplies, toilet paper. "People think we're an air base," Geary tells a visiting reporter. "We're not. We're a logistics base that happens to operate aircraft. For every hour a B-17 spends in the air, we spend 40 hours on the ground supporting it." The numbers prove him right. Each heavy bomber base employs approximately 3,000 ground personnel to support 50 to 60 aircraft and 500 aircrew. The ratio is 6 ground crew for every 1 airman. And that's just on the base itself. It doesn't count the massive supply infrastructure behind it. By 0630 hours, the last B-17 from Thorpe Abbotts lifts off and climbs east. The ground crews don't rest. They're already preparing for the return, expecting some aircraft to come back damaged, some to have wounded aboard, some not to return at all. This is the daily rhythm of the bases. Launch, wait, recover, repair, repeat. But here's the number that captures the scale of what these 122 bases accomplish in spring 1944. On a single day, May 19th, 1944, the 8th Air Force launches 1,287 heavy bombers against targets in Germany. That's 1,287 takeoffs, 1,287 landings, more than 12 million pounds of bombs loaded, 2.8 million gallons of fuel pumped, 38,610 aircrew, briefed and debriefed, all in one day. Multiply that operational tempo across weeks, across months, and the infrastructure achievement becomes clear. These aren't just airfields. They're the most intensive military-industrial operation in a single geographic area in history. But the bases enable something beyond raw numbers. They enable strategic bombing doctrine to move from theory to devastating reality, General Curtis LeMay, commander of the 3rd Bombardment Division, stands at his headquarters in Elvedon Hall and looks at a map showing all active bases in his command. Each pin represents a group. Each group represents 48 bombers. Each bomber represents 10 men. LeMay sees what Hap Arnold envisioned in 1942, a strategic bombing force large enough to attack multiple German cities simultaneously, to overwhelm German defenses through sheer numbers, to systematically destroy Germany's industrial capacity. This is the air force that makes invasion possible, LeMay writes in a memo to Arnold. Without these bases, without this concentration of power, D-Day would be suicide. German fighters would massacre the invasion fleet. But we've drawn the Luftwaffe up to fight us. We've forced them to defend their homeland. By June 6th, they won't have reserves to oppose the landing. He's right. In the 6 months before D-Day, the 8th Air Force flies more than 150,000 individual bomber sorties against Germany. The Luftwaffe loses more than 2,200 fighters trying to stop them. By June 1944, German air defenses are shattered. The infrastructure in England has accomplished what armies couldn't: air superiority over Europe. But this achievement has a darker side that becomes visible every evening when the bombers return. RAF Thorpe Abbotts, 1830 hours. De Stefano stands on the perimeter track, counting aircraft. 21 departed this morning. 18 are circling to land. 3 are missing. 1 struggles in on 2 engines, fires red flares indicating wounded aboard. Ambulances race to meet it. Another lands with hydraulic failure, overshoots the runway, and crashes into a drainage ditch. The crew walks away. The 3rd missing aircraft never returns. 10 men gone. This is also what the bases enable: an industrial scale of combat losses. Each base has a cemetery section. Each base has a casualty processing system. Each base has form letters ready to send to families back home. The infrastructure that makes strategic bombing possible also makes strategic dying possible. By the end of the war, the 8th Air Force will suffer 47,000 casualties, 26,000 dead, 21,000 wounded or captured. That's a casualty rate higher than any other American military branch except the Marine Corps. Every single one of those casualties will launch from or return to one of these 122 bases. The concrete doesn't just enable missions, it enables sacrifice on an industrial scale. But in spring 1944, before D-Day, before the final desperate months of the war, the bases represent something else: American power made visible. A massive, undeniable footprint stamped onto Allied territory. Proof that America has arrived, has committed, has transformed the strategic landscape literally and figuratively. RAF pilots, flying defensive patrols over England, look down and see what Stephen Spender saw: their country transformed. Every returning RAF flight passes over American bases. Every British farmer in East Anglia lives within sight of at least one American airfield. The bases are impossible to ignore, impossible to escape. They dominate the landscape, dominate the economy, dominate the consciousness of everyone in Eastern England. Squadron leader James Ginger Lacey, a Battle of Britain veteran now flying patrols, writes in his diary, "We saved Britain in 1940, flying from grass fields, scattered across the south. The Americans are trying to win the war from concrete empires in the East. I don't know which achievement is greater. But I know which one has changed England more permanently." He's asking the question that will become urgent within months. What happens to this concrete empire when the war ends? May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. At RAF Thurley, at Molesworth, at Bassingbourn, at every American base across England, celebrations explode. The war in Europe is over. Germany has surrendered. The strategic bombing campaign, the reason these bases exist, has accomplished its mission. Within weeks, the celebration gives way to a harder question. Now what? The 8th Air Force begins demobilization almost immediately. Bomber groups are deactivated, sent to the Pacific, or shipped home. By June 1945, dozens of bases that launched 1,000 bomber raids months earlier sit nearly empty. The process is shockingly rapid. At Grafton-Underwood, home of the 384th Bomb Group, the last B-17 departs on June 18, 1945. By July 1st, the base is functionally abandoned. 2 years of round-the-clock operations, tens of thousands of missions, gone in 2 weeks. Major General Orville Anderson, now overseeing the drawdown, walks through the empty bases and realizes the Americans built too well. These facilities were supposed to be temporary, wartime expedients that would be dismantled after victory. But you can't dismantle 1.5 miles of concrete runway. You can't unpour millions of cubic yards of aggregate and asphalt. We built these bases to last 5 years, Anderson notes in his final report. They'll last 50, and that's Britain's problem now, not ours. The British government suddenly faces an unprecedented dilemma. What do you do with 122 massive military installations you didn't want, didn't build, but now own? The immediate issue is legal. Most of the land was requisitioned, not purchased. The original owners, farmers displaced in 1942–43, technically have the right to reclaim their property. But their property no longer exists. It's buried under concrete. The Ministry of Agriculture convenes emergency meetings throughout summer 1945. The numbers are staggering. 100,000 acres of land removed from agricultural production. Much of it Britain's most productive farmland. And now Britain faces a post-war food crisis as severe as the wartime one. Thomas Walden, the Thurley farmer displaced in 1942, receives notification in August 1945 that he can reclaim his land. He travels to Thurley to see what his land now looks like. He finds 3 concrete runways, each 6,000 feet long and 150 feet wide. He finds 50 hard stands. He finds miles of perimeter track. He finds abandoned barracks, empty hangars, a control tower now silent. He does not find his farm. "They told me I could have my land back," Walden tells a reporter from the Bedford Times. "But this isn't land anymore. This is an American monument to a war we won. And I'm supposed to farm it?" The ministry offers compensation for permanent requisition. The amount, £1,200, roughly equivalent to £65,000 in modern currency. Walden's farm, at 1945 agricultural values, is worth at least triple that. And that doesn't account for 3 years of lost production, lost income, the emotional cost of displacement. Walden takes the money. He has no choice. He's 58 years old. He has no farm, and the government has made it clear that returning the land to agriculture would cost more than continued requisition. His story repeats across East Anglia. Of the 2,000-plus families displaced between 1942 and 1944, fewer than 200 successfully reclaim and restore their land to agricultural use. The rest accept compensation and move on. Their family farms, some worked for centuries, disappear beneath concrete that will outlast their great-grandchildren. But the British government faces an even larger problem. What to do with bases nobody reclaimed? The RAF, studying the network, identifies 25 bases worth keeping for post-war use. These become permanent RAF stations. Another 30 are turned over to the Ministry of Supply for weapons testing and storage. A few become civilian airports, Bassingbourn, Molesworth and several others. That still leaves nearly 70 bases, more than half the total, with no clear purpose. They're too large to convert back to agriculture economically. They're too expensive to maintain unused. They're too politically sensitive to simply destroy. The solution, arrived at through bureaucratic exhaustion rather than planning, is slow abandonment. Starting in 1946, the bases begin deteriorating. Without maintenance, without heating, without care, the structures decay. Runways crack in freeze-thaw cycles. Hangars rust. Barracks become home to squatters and then to pigeons. The carefully engineered drainage systems clog and fail, turning bases into enormous concrete swamps. By 1950, many bases look post-apocalyptic. Miles of cracked concrete, rusting equipment, buildings with collapsed roofs and shattered windows. Nature begins reclaiming what it can. Weeds growing through runway cracks, trees sprouting in abandoned hardstands. Local councils, suddenly responsible for these massive abandoned sites, scramble to find uses. Some sections are broken up and used for road construction. American concrete, poured for bombers, now paving British highways. Some bases become industrial sites, warehouses, factories, storage facilities. Some become housing estates, subdivisions built on old perimeter tracks. At RAF Polebrook, the runways are broken up with jackhammers and explosives in 1955. The concrete is crushed and used to build the A1 motorway extension. A runway that launched bombers to Berlin becomes part of Britain's post-war transportation network. But here's what nobody anticipated. The bases refuse to completely disappear. They're too massive, too well built, too deeply embedded in the landscape. Even when authorities try to erase them, the concrete resists. Farmers who attempt to return land to agriculture discover they can't plow deeper than a foot without hitting aggregate and concrete. The drainage systems the Americans built so carefully now disrupt natural water flow, creating floods in unexpected places. The compacted earth beneath old runways won't support deep-rooted crops. The land remembers what was done to it. By 1960, 15 years after VE Day, most of the bases are functionally gone, demolished, converted, or absorbed. But from the air, they're still visible. The concrete might be broken up, but the outline remains. The geometric patterns interrupt the organic field boundaries. The ghost of the greatest concentration of military air power in history is still visible from altitude. Wing Commander David Scott, RAF, flying a reconnaissance route over East Anglia in 1963, notes in his log, counted remnants of at least 40 former. American bases from 10,000 feet. Most officially demolished, all still visible. Doubt they'll ever truly disappear. He's right, because while the British government and local councils were systematically erasing the physical bases, something unexpected was happening. Memory was preserving to them. Present day. Seething, Norfolk. Dr. Catherine Morrison walks across a wheat field 2 miles south of Norwich. She's an aviation archaeologist at the University of East Anglia, specializing in World War II airfield sites. She's standing in the middle of what was once RAF Seething, home to the 448th Bombardment Group. Most people driving past this field see wheat. Morrison sees an airfield. She pulls out a 1944 aerial photograph and holds it up against the modern landscape. The match is perfect. That slight rise in the field contour. That was the control tower's foundation. The linear depression running northeast to southwest. That was the main runway, broken up in 1957, but still affecting drainage patterns. The circular clearings where wheat grows differently, those were hard stands. The bases never really went away, Morrison explains. We thought we'd erased them. But we only hid them. They're still here, written into the landscape like scar tissue. She's part of a growing movement to document and preserve what remains of the American airfield network, because while physical structures have mostly vanished, evidence remains everywhere, if you know how to look. Crop marks are the most visible evidence. Vegetation grows differently over buried concrete and compacted earth. During dry summers, crops above old runways yellow earlier than surrounding fields. From the air, the entire airfield layout appears like a ghost image superimposed on farmland. Ground-penetrating radar reveals even more. Beneath apparently normal fields, the radar finds concrete runways buried under 3 feet of topsoil. It finds the massive concrete pads where hangars stood. It finds foundations, drainage systems, and unexploded ordnance. Bombs that rolled off munitions trucks and were simply buried rather than removed. The RAF Bomb Disposal Unit still receives calls about American ordnance discovered by farmers plowing fields that were bases 75 years ago. Last year alone, they removed 14 500-pound bombs, 200-plus pounds of .50 caliber ammunition, and a nose section from a B-17 that crashed on takeoff in 1944 and was bulldozed into a drainage ditch. But the most remarkable preservation isn't physical, it's human. At Thorpe Abbotts, local volunteers have restored the control tower and created a museum dedicated to the 100th Bomb Group. The restoration is meticulous. 1940s equipment, original furniture, even the radio frequencies painted on the walls. Peter Last, curator of the museum, grew up in the village. He was 8 years old when the Americans arrived in 1943. He's now 86, and he's spent the last 30 years preserving the memory of the base. People ask me why we care, Last says, gesturing at the restored control tower. The Americans left 80 years ago. The base has been gone for 75 years. Why preserve it? He walks to a wall covered in photographs. Young men in leather flight jackets. Crews posing in front of B-17s. Some of these men died on missions launched from this base. Some made it home. All of them are gone now. Because this is where history happened, Last says. This field, this specific field, launched bombers that changed the course of the war. 306 men from the 100th Bomb Group died flying from here. That matters. That must be remembered. The preservation movement has spread across former base sites. At Molesworth, at Kimbolton, at Grafton Underwood, at dozens of locations, local historical societies have erected memorials, restored fragments of buildings, created museums in old control towers or Nissen huts. But here's the unexpected turn. The American bases have become part of British heritage. Villages that resisted requisition in 1942, that protested the American presence, now celebrate it. The bases are tourist attractions. They're points of civic pride. They're woven into local identity. The village of Deenethorpe hosts an annual memorial service for the 401st Bomb Group. American veterans and their families travel from the United States to attend. British schoolchildren learn about the base's history. The village pub has a room dedicated to the 401st, filled with photographs, medals, and artifacts. Margaret Tilney, the woman who spoke against the requisition in 1942, lived to see this transformation. Before her death in 1998, she gave an interview to the Imperial War Museum. I hated them when they came, hated what they did to our land, hated the noise, the disruption, the arrogance of it all. But then I watched their bombers return with wounded aboard. I watched ambulances race to crashed aircraft. I helped nurse American boys who'd been shot to pieces over Germany. And I realized they didn't want to be here either. They wanted to go home, but they came anyway, and they died here, and that changed everything. The shift in perspective is generational. The farmers who lost their land never forgave the requisition. Their children saw economic opportunity in the American presence. Their grandchildren see history worth preserving. Professor Mark Harris, historian at King's College London, has studied the cultural legacy of the bases. Britain's relationship with the American airfields is complicated. They represent invasion and alliance simultaneously. They represent loss of land, of sovereignty, of agricultural heritage. But they also represent sacrifice, American sacrifice on British soil for a common cause. Modern Britain has chosen to remember the sacrifice and contextualize the invasion. But ask anyone whose grandfather lost his farm, and you'll get a different story. Yet even critics acknowledge the base's historical significance. The construction of 122 heavy bomber stations in less than 3 years remains one of the greatest engineering achievements in military history. The operational tempo they enabled, 1,000-plus bomber raids multiple times per week for 18 months, has never been replicated. The bases made strategic bombing a reality rather than a theory. They made D-Day possible by achieving air superiority over Europe. They demonstrated American industrial and logistical power on an unprecedented scale. And they changed England permanently. Current estimates suggest that approximately 25% of original base infrastructure still exists in some form. 15 bases remain active as RAF stations or USAF facilities. 22 bases became civilian airports or industrial sites. 8 bases are partially preserved as museums or memorials. 77 bases were demolished, but crop marks and underground structures remain. That means miles of American concrete still lie beneath British fields. Thousands of acres of land will never fully return to their pre-war state. The drainage patterns of eastern England were permanently altered by American engineering. Dr. Morrison, the aviation archaeologist, summarizes it simply. We tried to erase the bases. We failed. They're too big, too well built, too deeply embedded. In a very real sense, there are still 122 American bases in England. We just can't see most of them anymore. But they're there, underground, waiting. And increasingly they're being rediscovered. Climate change is exposing bases that were buried decades ago. Severe droughts make crop marks more visible. Extreme rainfall erodes topsoil, revealing concrete beneath. Rising sea levels threaten coastal bases, exposing runway sections that were buried under beach sand. In 2018, severe drought across England made 47 former airfield sites visible from satellite imagery. Bases that had been effectively invisible for decades suddenly reappeared as geometric ghosts across the countryside. The bases are literally rising from the ground. But perhaps the most powerful legacy isn't physical, it's diplomatic. The relationship forged during the war, the alliance tested by those 122 construction projects, endures. Modern American military installations in the UK can trace their lineage directly to the emergency construction of 1942 to 1944. RAF Mildenhall, RAF Lakenheath, RAF Fairford, all US Air Force bases today, all built on the foundation of that wartime partnership. The concrete poured in desperation has become the bedrock of a permanent alliance. And in the villages of East Anglia, in the wheat fields of Lincolnshire, In the museum staffed by volunteers who remember, the story continues. The story of how America transformed England, how urgency defeated impossibility, how concrete and sovereignty collided and somehow coexisted. The story of how war doesn't just destroy landscapes, it creates them. Thomas Walden died in 1962. He never farmed again after 1942. But his great-granddaughter, Emma Walden, is a pilot for British Airways. She flies Boeing 777s across the Atlantic, aircraft that trace their engineering lineage directly to the B-17S that displaced her great-grandfather. She's based at Heathrow, built on similar wartime emergency construction principles that created the bomber bases. I used to be angry about what happened to my great-grandfather, she says. Then I realized I have the career I have because of what those bases represented, because of what they proved possible. They took his farm. But they opened up the sky. I don't know if that's justice, but it's something. On a summer evening, if you drive through Norfolk or Cambridgeshire or Lincolnshire, you can still find them. The control towers that weren't demolished, the Nissan huts converted to farm storage, the segments of perimeter track now serving as driveways, the hangars repurposed as warehouses. And if you walk into the wheat fields, if you know what you're looking for, you can find the hard stands, circles of ground where grass grows differently, where plows catch on buried concrete, where the earth still remembers what stood there. 122 bases. Most forgotten. Some preserved. All still present, like ghosts written into the landscape itself. The greatest construction project in military history, the infrastructure that made victory possible, the concrete empire that transformed England, and then, somehow, vanished without ever really leaving.